My name is Vanessa. I am 63 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that a mother's love was a debt her children would never think to collect. I was wrong about that. I learned how wrong on a cold Sunday evening in Millbrook, North Carolina, at my own dinner table in the house I had paid for with my own hands. My son put me on the floor of that house while his wife held up a phone and laughed. And what neither of them understood, what they could not have understood, was that the paper that made that house theirs had never actually been signed into being. It was still mine. Every board, every window, every inch of it. My name was still on the deed, and I had spent 30 years of my working life learning exactly what that meant. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the trouble started, because the ending only makes sense if you understand how quiet the beginning was. I bought that house 11 years ago, a year after my husband Raymond died. We had owned a smaller place across town, a 2-bedroom with a crooked porch and a maple tree that dropped helicopters all over the yard every spring. When Raymond passed, that house felt too big and too small at the same time. Too big because I rattled around in it alone. Too small because his absence took up more room than he ever had. So I sold it, and I took the money from that sale, and I took the savings we had built through decades of careful living, and I bought the house on Linden Street. 3 bedrooms, a real dining room, a kitchen with good light. I paid the down payment myself. I signed the mortgage myself. I made every payment from an account that had only my name on it. I want you to remember that because it matters later. My son Douglas was 28 when I bought that house. By the time the trouble came, he was 39. He had married a woman named Brooke 6 years earlier, a wedding I paid for in part because Douglas said he was between opportunities. He was always between opportunities. There was a stretch when they were saving for a place of their own, or so they told me, and I offered them a room. Just for a while, I said. Just until you get on your feet. That was 4 years before the Sunday I am telling you about. They never left. And somewhere in those 4 years, without any single moment, I could point to the arrangement changed shape. I stopped being a mother who had opened her home. I became a woman who was allowed to remain in a house that they had decided was theirs. Brooke was the one who made the shift feel official. She was cool with me in a way that never gave me anything to object to out loud. She would rearrange my kitchen and call it helping. She would sigh when I sat in the living room as though my presence were a draft she could not close out. When guests came, she introduced me as Douglas's mother who lives with us, and she put a small emphasis on the last 3 words that only I seemed to hear. I told myself I was imagining it. A woman my age learns to tell herself a great many things in order to keep the peace. Douglas was different. Douglas had a temper, and the temper had gotten worse as the years wore on him. He worked in sales, or he had worked in sales, and then in something else, and then in something after that, and each change came with more money talk and less money. When he was frustrated, he would find the nearest soft target, and I was always nearby and always soft. He would remind me in front of Brooke that I was fortunate to have a roof. He would say it lightly like a joke, and then watch my face to see if the joke had landed where he aimed it. It usually had. Here's the thing I never said to either of them. Before I retired, I spent 31 years as an escrow and title officer. That is not a glamorous job. It does not make for good stories at parties. But it means that for 3 decades, I sat at the center of other people's biggest transactions, and I watched what happens when the paperwork is wrong. I closed thousands of home sales. I read deeds the way other people read the morning news. I knew what a valid transfer looked like, and I knew better than almost anyone in that town what an invalid one looked like. And I knew in the quiet back of my mind where I did not like to look that the transfer Douglas believed had made the house his had never actually happened. Let me explain that because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. About 3 years into their stay, Douglas came to me with a stack of papers and a smooth story about protecting the house. He said that if it stayed in my name and something happened to me, the whole thing would get tangled in probate, and taxes would eat it alive, and wouldn't it be simpler to put it in his name now, cleanly, while everyone was healthy? He was very patient explaining it. Brooke brought me tea. I signed something that night at the kitchen table, and Douglas took the papers away, and from that night forward, he spoke of the house as his. But I was a title officer for 31 years, and what I signed was not a deed. It was a private agreement Douglas had printed off the internet, a 1-page thing full of confident language and no legal force. There was no proper conveyance. There was no notarization by anyone with authority. Nothing was ever recorded. Douglas did not know the difference because to him a signed paper was a signed paper. To me, the difference was the difference between a wish and a fact. I let him believe what he wanted to believe. I told myself it kept the peace. That was the excuse I used for everything in those years. It kept the peace. The peace ended on a Sunday in November. I had made a pot roast because it was Douglas's favorite as a boy, and some stubborn part of me still cooked for the boy instead of the man. The three of us sat down. The light was already failing outside the early dark that comes in the Carolina hills that time of year. I remember the sound of Brooke's fork against her plate, small and precise, like she was tapping out a code. I said something that evening that I did not think was dangerous. I said that I had been meaning to have an old friend of mine, a retired accountant, take a look at my financial paperwork. My statements, my accounts, the odds and ends I had let slide since Raymond died. I said it the way you mention a chore. I want to get my affairs in order, I said. I would like a fresh set of eyes. I did not understand then why the temperature at the table dropped so fast. I understand it now, but in the moment, all I saw was Douglas's jaw go tight and Brooke's fork go still, and a look pass between them that I was not meant to see. You don't need to bother anyone with that, Douglas said. His voice had the careful flatness it got right before it broke. I only want things organized, I said. It's nothing. It's not nothing, he said, and now the flatness was gone. You go poking around with some accountant and you'll just confuse yourself and cause problems. You don't understand that stuff, Mom. I had closed 11,000 real estate transactions in my life. I understood that stuff better than every person at that table combined. But I did not say so. I had a lifetime of practice not saying so. I looked down at my plate and I said quietly that I only wanted to understand my own accounts. That was when he stood up. The chair scraped hard against the floor. I have replayed the next part more times than I can count, and it never gets slower, and it never makes more sense. He came around the table. I thought absurdly that he was going to hug me, that this was going to resolve into something soft, the way our fights sometimes did. Instead, he took me by the arm hard, and he pulled me up out of my chair, and when I stumbled, he shoved me, and I went down against the edge of the sideboard and then to the floor. I want to be precise about what happened next, because it is the thing I could never forgive more than the fall itself. From the floor with my hips screaming and my glasses knocked crooked, I looked up, and Brooke had her phone out. She was holding it up, framing me the way you frame a scene you want to remember. And she was laughing. Not a nervous laugh. Not a shocked one. A delighted one, the laugh of a person watching exactly what she came to see. Get up, Douglas said, standing over me. Look at you. You want to hire people to go through my finances in my house. I did not get up. I did not cry out. Something in me had gone very cold and very still. And in that stillness, a clarity arrived that I had not felt in years. I lay on the floor of the house I had bought, and I looked at my son standing over me, and I looked at his wife, filming it for her own amusement, and a single thought moved through me with the weight of a verdict. This is not my home. This has not been my home for a long time, and it was never theirs. I got myself up slowly, holding the sideboard. I did not speak to either of them. I walked down the hall to my room at the back of the house, and I shut the door, and I sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were shaking. But they were not shaking with fear. They were shaking the way the ground shakes when something enormous underneath it finally shifts into a new position and will never shift back. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my clothes on top of the covers, and I listened to them in the living room. They did not lower their voices. They had no reason to. At one point I heard Brooke laugh again. That same private laugh, and I heard the tinny sound of my own voice playing back from her phone, and I understood that she was watching the video for the second time. My humiliation had become their evening's entertainment, but I was not planning revenge that night, not the way you might imagine it. I was doing something colder and more useful. I was making a list. 31 years of closing other people's disasters had taught me that the difference between a victim and a person who prevails is almost always the same thing. Documentation. Evidence. The quiet, patient assembly of facts that a court cannot argue with. So while they laughed in the next room, I began in my head to build a file. At first light, I did the first thing on that list. I got up, I moved carefully because my hip had stiffened into a deep ache, and I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. There was a bruise blooming along my forearm where he had gripped me, and a darker one spreading over my hip, and a scrape along my cheekbone from the sideboard. I did not cover any of it. Instead, I took my phone, and I photographed all of it carefully in good light, the way I had once photographed damaged properties for a file. Time stamped. Clear. Then I dressed and I told them through the closed living room door that I was going to the pharmacy, and I drove myself to the emergency room at the county hospital instead. I told the truth to the nurse who saw me. I told her my son had done it. I let them examine me and photograph the injuries and write it all down in their careful clinical language, and I asked for a copy of the record before I left. The young doctor looked at me with a gentleness that almost undid the composure I had worked so hard to hold. "Is there somewhere safe you can go?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but there will be. I need a few things to be in order first." That was the truth. I drove home the long way past the streets where Douglas had learned to ride a bicycle, past the school where I used to wait for him at the gate, and I felt the old love and the new cold sitting side by side in me, neither one canceling the other. When I got back, the house was empty. Sunday had turned into Monday. They had gone to work to whatever work they were doing that season, and the house was quiet and full of morning light, and it looked as it always looked, like it belonged to me, because it did. I went to the small desk in my room where I kept my papers. Old habits from a lifetime of transactions had made me a careful keeper of records, and I had files most people would never bother with. And there, in a folder I had not opened in years, I found what I already knew I would find. The original deed to the house on Linden Street. My name on it alone. And beside it, in a separate folder, the one-page agreement Douglas had printed off the internet 3 years earlier and had me sign. I read it again in the morning light with a professional's eye, and I almost laughed. It was worthless. It conveyed nothing. It was a wish dressed up as a document, and my son had built his whole sense of ownership on top of it. I would have stopped there, perhaps. I would have taken my time, made my plans slowly and gently if I had not found the other thing. Because tucked into Douglas's usual careless pile of mail on the hall table, the mail he never bothered to sort, there was an envelope from a mortgage company. And because I had spent 31 years reading exactly this kind of paper, I understood it in a single glance. My son was in the early stages of trying to borrow against the house. To pull cash out of a property he believed was his, using a deed he believed was valid in a transaction that would have blown up in his face and possibly mine the moment a title search was run. He was going to leverage my home out from under me, and he had no idea that the ground he was standing on was mine. I stood in the hallway of that quiet house with the mortgage letter in one hand and the deed in the other, and the last of my hesitation drained out of me. This was no longer about whether I would act. It was only about how fast. Because a man who will put his mother on the floor for asking to see her own accounts is a man who is already reaching for everything she has. And I had spent my whole life watching what happens to people who wait too long to protect what is theirs. I was not going to be one of them. I put the deed in my purse. I put the mortgage letter beside it. And I picked up the phone to call the one person in Millbrook who would understand exactly what these two pieces of paper meant when placed side by side. An old friend of Raymond's, a man who had spent his own career on the other side of the closing table from me, and who had told me once years ago that if I ever needed him, I only had to ask. I was about to ask. Walter Briggs opened his front door, still holding his morning coffee, and when he saw my face, the coffee was forgotten. He had been Raymond's friend for 40 years, and mine for nearly as long a title attorney who had sat across the closing table from me on more deals than either of us could count before we both retired. He was a careful man, slow to speak and slower to alarm, but he looked at the scrape on my cheek and the way I was favoring my right hip, and his face changed. "Vanessa," he said, "who did this?" "Douglas," I said. There was no point in softening it. "I have known you a long time, Walter. I need your help, and I need it to be exactly right. Not fast. Right." He stepped back from the door without a word and held it open for me, and that small courtesy almost broke the composure I had carried up his front walk. It had been a long time since a man had held a door for me, as though I were someone worth the trouble. His house smelled of coffee and old paper, and the pipe he was not supposed to smoke anymore, and it was warm, and I realized as I stepped inside that I had been cold for hours. Cold since the emergency room, cold since the floor, a cold that had nothing to do with the November air. He brought me inside and sat me down at his kitchen table and put a cup of coffee in front of me, and did not say a single thing while I wrapped both hands around it. He did not ask another question until I had told him everything. I laid it out the way I would have laid out a file for a closing. The house, the money it was bought with, the account, The payments came from the night Douglas had me sign the internet agreement, the Sunday at the table, the emergency room, the photographs, and finally the mortgage letter. I put the original deed on his kitchen table, and I put the one-page agreement beside it, and I watched his face as he read them both, and I saw the moment he reached the same conclusion I had reached the night before. "This agreement is worthless," he said quietly, tapping the one-page thing. "It conveys nothing. It was never a valid deed. It was never notarized by anyone with authority. It was never recorded." He looked at the real deed. "This is the only instrument that governs ownership of that house, and your name is the only name on it. Legally, Vanessa, the house is yours. It has always been yours." "I know," I said. "I have known since the night I signed his paper. I just needed to hear another title man say it out loud. And there was more to it than that, though I did not say the rest. For 11 years, I had carried this piece of knowledge alone the way you carry a stone in your shoe on a long walk, telling yourself it does not hurt enough to stop and deal with. I had told myself the deed in the drawer did not matter because I would never need it, because Douglas was my son, and a son does not turn on his mother. I had used that certainty like a blanket, and I had pulled it over my head and gone back to sleep for 4 long years. Hearing Walter say the words out loud did not surprise me. It woke me. It made real in another person's voice the thing I had been too afraid to make real in my own. "Raymond would have known what to do," I said quietly, mostly to myself. He always knew. Walter looked at me over his glasses. "Raymond married a woman who spent 31 years knowing what to do for everyone else in this county," he said. "You do not need him for this, Vanessa. You are the one people like Raymond used to come to. I watched you do it 100 times. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years, and it was also I understood the plain truth, and I let it settle into me and do its quiet work. Then he did the thing a good lawyer does that a hopeful client never wants. He told me what was hard. Knowing you own it and getting them out of it are 2 different problems, he said. Douglas and Brooke are living there. Under North Carolina law, once someone is residing in a home, you cannot simply change the locks and put their things on the curb. That is not eviction, that is a crime, and it would hand him a weapon to use against you. Even as the true owner, you have to go through the court. You file to establish clear title and to remove them as occupants, and a judge orders them out, and only then do they legally have to go. That takes time. Weeks, possibly months. I understood. I had watched it from the other side my whole career. "I am prepared for it to take time," I said. "I have waited 4 years already. What else?" Walter hesitated, and I could see he was reluctant to say the next part. "Douglas may argue that he has an equitable interest," he said. "He has lived there 4 years. If he can show he made the mortgage payments, contributed to the property, treated it as his own, with your knowledge, a lawyer could try to build a claim that he is owed something even if the title is yours. It would not likely win, but it could slow us down and cost you, and a desperate man with a lawyer can make a great deal of noise." And that is where I set the second piece of paper on his table, because I had spent 31 years learning that the person who keeps the records is the person who wins. "Douglas has told Brooke for years that he pays for that house," I said. "He tells everyone. He told it to me across my own dinner table 2 nights ago, but he has never paid a cent of that mortgage. I have. Every payment for 11 years out of an account with only my name on it. And I have every statement. 11 years of them. I did not throw a single one away." Walter went very still. Then a slow, grim smile touched the corner of his mouth. The smile of a man who has just watched the opposing side's best argument collapse before it was ever made. "Then he has no equitable claim," he said. "None. He did not contribute. He occupied. Vanessa, you did not just keep the deed. You kept the proof that everything he believes about that house is a story he told himself." I did not smile back. I felt no triumph, only a cold clarity, the same clarity that had come to me on the floor. "He built his whole life on a paper that never existed," I said, "and he never once wondered why I let him." We spent the rest of that morning making a plan, and the plan was not loud, and it was not vengeful, and it did not happen in a single dramatic afternoon, the way I think some part of me had darkly wished it would. It happened the way real things happen, in order, step by careful step. The first step was safety, and Walter was firm about it. "You do not sleep in that house again," he said. "Not one more night. If he put you on the floor for asking about your accounts, there is no telling what he does when he learns the ground is moving under him." So that afternoon I went back to the house one last time while it was still empty, and I packed one suitcase. Only what I truly needed. A few changes of clothes, my medications, the folder, Raymond's photograph from the dresser. I stood in the doorway of the room that had been mine for 11 years, the room at the back where I had gone to be small and quiet after every fight, and I felt no grief at leaving it, only a strange light feeling like setting down a weight I had carried so long, I had stopped feeling it as weight. Everything else in that house could stay. It had never really been mine, that furniture, those dishes, the life arranged around other people's comfort. I took my suitcase and my folder, and I walked out the back door, and I did not look back at it, and I drove across town to the home of my oldest friend in the world. Diane and I had known each other since we were girls in pigtails on the same street, and we had watched each other bury husbands and raise children and grow old, and there is a kind of friendship that does not require you to explain yourself. When I called her from Walter's kitchen and told her in the plainest words what my son had done, she did not gasp or fuss or ask me the questions that would have made me relive it. She said, "Your room is ready. It has been ready your whole life. Come home." And when I pulled into her driveway, she was standing on the porch in the cold with the light behind her. And she came down the steps, and she took my suitcase out of my hand, and she put her arm around me, and only then, in the arms of a woman I had known for 60 years, did I finally let myself cry. Not on the floor, not in front of them. I had saved it for the one place it was safe to spend it. And I did. The second step was the protective order, and Walter would not let me delay it. There is a habit in women of my generation of minimizing, of saying it was not that bad, of saying he did not mean it, of finding a way to make the man's violence into something the woman must have somehow invited. I had spent my whole life around that habit in myself and in others, and Walter knew it, and he would not let me indulge it. The day after I moved into Diane's spare room, he drove me to the courthouse himself. I knew that building. I had walked into it 1,000 times in 31 years to record deeds and pull title histories and file the ordinary paperwork of other people's lives. I knew the marble floors and the sound my heels made on them, and the clerk at the recording desk who had been there almost as long as I had. But I had never once walked in as the person who needed the court's protection, and the floors sounded different under me that morning, and the building felt larger and colder, and I understood for the first time in my life how it must feel to the frightened people I had watched pass through those halls for 3 decades. I brought the photographs. I brought the emergency room record with its careful clinical language, the language that turned my son's hands into words like contusion and abrasion, and mechanism of injury consistent with reported assault. I stood in front of a magistrate, a tired, kind-faced woman about my own age, and I told the truth in a steady voice, and my voice did not shake, and I was proud of that, in a small, fierce way I could not have explained. The magistrate looked at the pictures of the bruises on a 63-year-old woman's arm and hip, and something passed across her face, and she granted the order that afternoon. Douglas was ordered to stay away from me and from Diane's home. It was a piece of paper. But it was my piece of paper now, filed and stamped and real in every way his had never been. The third step was the house itself, and here my whole career came back to serve me. Walter filed the action to establish clear title and to remove Douglas and Brooke as occupants. That was the slow engine that would grind forward over the coming weeks in the courthouse, whether Douglas fought it or not. But I was not content to only take the house back. I intended to be gone from Millbrook entirely, to sell the place and turn it into the beginning of a life instead of the ruin of one. And because I had closed thousands of sales, I knew how to line a sale up correctly instead of recklessly. I did not do what the frightened, angry version of me wanted to do, which was to sell the house out from under them in an afternoon and let them come home to strangers. I had watched enough disasters in 31 years to know that a sale like that would be a disaster of its own. No honest buyer closes on an occupied home in the middle of a dispute, and no title company insures one. So I did it properly. Through an agent I had trusted for 20 years, I found a couple named the Prescott's Patient People who had been looking in the area for a long time and who were not afraid of a closing that would take a while. We signed a purchase agreement with a plain and powerful condition written into it. The sale would close only after the house was legally vacant and the title was confirmed clear in my name by the court. The Prescotts understood exactly what they were agreeing to. They were buying the end of my old life, and they were willing to wait for the court to finish clearing the way. So the machinery was set. Title action moving through the court. Protective order in place. Sale contracted and waiting. Photographs and hospital records and 11 years of mortgage statements sitting in a folder that no one could argue with. And for the first time since I had gotten up off that floor, I slept through a whole night in Diane's quiet house with the mountains dark and enormous outside the window. It did not stay quiet. The court papers were served on Douglas at the house on a Thursday. I was not there to see it, and I did not want to be. But I did not need to be, because I could imagine every second of it. My son coming home from whatever work he was pretending at that season, opening an envelope, and reading in the flat and merciless language of the court that his mother was not confused, was not helpless, and was in fact removing him from a house he had never owned and selling it out from under a lie he had told for years. I imagine the paper shook in his hands. I imagine Brooke read it over his shoulder and understood before he did that the comfortable life she had married into was built on nothing at all. He called Diane's house 11 times that night. I did not answer. He called my cell phone until I turned it off. And then sometime after 10, headlights swung into Diane's driveway, and I heard a car door slam, and I heard my son's voice in the yard, raised and ragged, shouting my name. Diane was already on her feet. She had lived alone a long time, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and I felt the old fear rise up in my chest, the way it always had, the reflex of decades, the animal part of me that still wanted to go small and quiet and make him stop. And then I felt it pass, because I remembered that I was not on the floor of his story anymore. I was in a house where I was welcome protected by an order with my name on it, and every threat he made from this point forward was not a danger to me. It was evidence. Call the police, I told Diane. Do not open the door. And write down the time. She dialed. I stood back from the window where he could not see me, and I watched my son pace the yard, shouting up at the dark house, telling me I had ruined him, telling me I was a crazy old woman, telling me he would take everything back. He was violating the protective order with every word on Diane's property in front of a witness, while a dispatcher listened on the other end of Diane's phone. 4 years ago, 2 nights ago, that voice in the yard would have shrunk me to nothing. Now I stood in the dark and listened to it the way I had once read other people's flawed paperwork, calmly professionally filing each detail away. The deputies arrived in under 15 minutes. I watched from the window as they spoke to him in the driveway, as his shouting turned to pleading, and then to sullen silence as they took down his name and mine and the number of the order he had just broken. They did not arrest him that night, but they documented every piece of it, and the report went into the same growing file as the photographs and the hospital record and the 11 years of statements. He had come to Diane's house to frighten me back into being his mother. Instead, he had handed the court one more page it could not argue with. When his car finally pulled away, tires loud on the gravel, Diane came and stood beside me at the window. Her hand found mine. "Are you all right?" she asked. I looked out at the empty driveway and past it at the mountains, and I found that I was. Not unshaken, but all right in a way I had not been in years. "He thinks this is over," I said. "He thinks he can shout it back into the shape it used to be." "And can he?" Diane asked. "No," I said. "But he is going to try something worse before he understands that. I have seen desperate men do desperate things with paper, and Douglas has always believed that a signed page is a fact. I did not know yet exactly what he would do, but I knew my son and I knew the world I had worked in for 31 years, and I knew that a man who had built his whole life on a worthless document was not going to walk away from that house without producing another one. I just did not yet understand how far he was willing to go to make it look real. The blow I had been waiting for came 3 weeks later, and it was worse than I had imagined, and it was exactly what I should have expected. Douglas hired a lawyer. A real one this time, not an internet form. And through that lawyer he filed his answer to our case, and attached to that answer was a document that made my blood go cold when Walter laid it in front of me. It was a deed. A warranty deed properly formatted transferring the house on Linden Street from me to my son Douglas. And at the bottom above my printed name was my signature. Not a scrawl, not an obvious forgery. My signature or something so close to it that when I first saw it for one terrible moment, I doubted my own memory. It was dated a little over 3 years earlier, the same season Douglas had sat me at the kitchen table and had me sign his worthless internet agreement. And below my signature was a notarial block, a notary's stamp, a commission number, a date, everything a real deed is supposed to have. I sat with that piece of paper in my hands for a long time in Walter's office, and I will tell you honestly that it frightened me more than my son's fist had. A fist you can see coming. A fist leaves a bruise you can photograph. But this was a lie so well made that it reached into my own memory and made me doubt the ground I stood on. That was the true violence of it. For a moment, holding my own signature above a stamp I had never seen, I felt the floor tilt, and I understood exactly how they had planned for me to feel every day of the life they had designed for me. Confused, uncertain, unable to trust my own mind. A woman who could be told what she had done and what she had not until she stopped knowing the difference. That I realized had been the whole point, not just to take the house, to take my certainty, to make me the kind of woman a court would look at and see someone who could not be trusted to know her own name. Walter watched my face as I read it, and I think he saw the tilt because his voice when he spoke was very gentle. "Vanessa," he said carefully, "I have to ask you this once plainly, and then I will never ask it again. Is there any chance you signed a real deed that night? Any chance at all?" I made myself sit with the question honestly because a lifetime in title work had taught me that the people who lose are the ones too proud to check their own certainty. I closed my eyes and I put myself back at that kitchen table 3 years ago with Brooke's tea going cold and Douglas talking his smooth talk about probate and taxes. I remembered the one-page agreement. I remembered signing it. And I remembered with total clarity that there had been no one else in that kitchen. No third person. No stranger with a stamp and a logbook watching me sign. And that single memory was the thread that would unravel everything. "No," I said, and I opened my eyes, and the cold clarity was back, and it did not leave me again. "I never signed a deed, Walter, and I will tell you exactly how I know, and it is not because I trust my memory, though I do. It is because of who was not in the room." He waited. "A deed like this is worthless without an acknowledgement," he said. "Without a notary. And a notary does not just stamp a piece of paper. A notary has to personally witness the signer confirm their identity and record the act in a journal with a date, and often a thumbprint at the moment it happens. There was no notary in my kitchen that night. There was no one but Douglas and Brooke and me. Which means that whoever put that notarial stamp on this deed was certifying that they watched me sign something they never saw me sign. And that Walter is not a paperwork error. That is fraud, and it can be proven because notaries leave a trail, and I spent 31 years learning how to read it. I did not sleep much over the next 2 weeks, but it was a different kind of not sleeping than that first night on the floor of Douglas's story. That first night I had been building a list. Now I was working the list, and the work suited me. It suited me more than anything had in years. There is a thing that happens to a person who is good at their work and has been made to feel useless for too long. When the work comes back, it does not feel like a burden. It feels like coming home. Diane would go to bed and I would stay up at her kitchen table under the yellow lamp with the forged deed and a legal pad and a pot of coffee. I had no intention of finishing, and I would feel my mind wake up all the way sharp and clear and entirely my own for the first time since the funeral. Douglas had spent 4 years telling me I did not understand that stuff, and here I was at midnight quietly taking apart the most important document of my life with the ease of a woman doing the crossword. I sat at Diane's kitchen table with the forged deed, and I did what I had done 10,000 times in my career. I read it like a professional looking for the lie, and the lies were there. They are almost always there for anyone who knows the shape of the truth well enough to see the absence of it. The first thing I checked was the notary's commission. Every notary in North Carolina is commissioned by the state for a fixed term, and that commission has an expiration date that is a matter of public record. The notarial block on Douglas's deed listed a commission number and a name. I looked them up, and the commission attached to that number had expired more than a year before the date printed on the deed. On the day my son claimed a notary had watched me sign away my house, that notary had held no valid commission at all. A real acknowledgement on that date was impossible. That alone would have been enough. But I was not raised to bring one bullet to a fight I could end. So I kept reading. The stamp impression on the deed did not match the format the state had required in the year printed on the document. The wording of the acknowledgement used language from a version of the statute that had changed. Small things. Invisible to Douglas, invisible to his lawyer, invisible to almost anyone who had not spent 3 decades staring at these exact blocks of text until their smallest deviations jumped off the page like a wrong note in a familiar song. To me, they were not small. To me, they were a confession. And then the second front opened the one I had not engineered and did not expect. Because a lawsuit is not just accusations. It comes with a process called discovery, where each side must turn over what it has, and Walter had demanded, among other things, any recordings either party held relating to the events in the house. Douglas's lawyer, perhaps not fully understanding what his client and his client's wife had done, complied. And there, delivered into evidence by the other side's own hand, was the video. Brooke's video. The one she had filmed from above me while I lay on the floor of my own dining room, the one I had heard her replaying and laughing at through the wall that first sleepless night. She had never deleted it. She had kept it the way people keep trophies. And now it belonged to the court. I made myself watch it once in Walter's office with him beside me. It was hard. It is one thing to remember being on that floor. It is another to see it from her angle, to see how small I looked and how steady the camera was, and to hear unmistakably the sound of her laughing while her husband stood over his mother. Walter reached over and stopped it when it was done and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said quietly, "They handed us the assault, Vanessa. They handed it to us themselves." The hearing on the title came on a gray morning in the county courthouse, a building I had walked into 1,000 times as a title officer, and never once as the person whose whole life was on the docket. I dressed carefully that morning, the way you dress for a thing that matters. Not to impress anyone, to remind myself who I was. I put on the good navy suit I had worn to close deals in for 20 years, the one that made me feel like a professional instead of a victim. And Diane fixed my collar the way a sister would, and she squeezed my shoulders once and said nothing, and we drove down out of the hills into Millbrook together. Douglas was there with his lawyer, and Brooke was there beside him, though I noticed she sat a careful few inches apart from him, the distance a person keeps from someone they have already decided to leave. She did not look at me. Not once the whole morning. I think she could not. It is one thing to laugh at a woman on the floor when you believe you have already won. It is another to sit in a courtroom and feel the winning come apart around you and know that the woman you filmed is watching you feel it. Douglas looked terrible. Thinner than when he had shouted in Diane's yard, gray in the face, the arrogance sanded off him and nothing solid left underneath. For one unguarded moment, before I remembered everything, I looked at my son across that courtroom, and my heart did the old helpless thing a mother's heart does, and I wanted to go to him. Then I remembered the floor and the laughing and the drained accounts I did not yet fully understand, and the moment passed, and I sat very still with my folder in my lap and my spine straight. His lawyer went first, and he led with the forged deed, and he spoke about it with all the confidence of a man who did not know he was holding a lit fuse. He described the transfer. He pointed to my signature. He pointed to the notarial block. He asked the court to find that I had conveyed the house to my son 3 years earlier, and that the woman now trying to sell it was at best confused about her own past actions. Then it was Walter's turn, and Walter was gentle and slow and merciless. He did not raise his voice once. He simply walked the court through what I had found. He put up the state's own record of the notary's commission and showed that it had expired more than a year before the date on the deed. He showed that no valid acknowledgement could have occurred on that day. He showed the mismatched stamp and the outdated statutory language. And then he called me to the stand. I want to tell you what that felt like because it was the turning point of my whole life, and not for the reason you might think. It was not the vindication. It was the voice. For 4 years I had sat at a table and swallowed my words. For 4 years my son had told me I did not understand, and I had let him. And the letting had become a habit, and the habit had become a cage. And now I sat in a witness chair in a courtroom under oath with a judge and my son's lawyer, all required by law to sit there and listen. And I opened my mouth, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I said exactly what I knew plainly without softening it, without swallowing it, without checking a single face to see whether it was safe to continue. I spoke not as a frightened mother, but as what I actually was, a professional who had spent 31 years certifying the difference between real documents and false ones. I explained to the court in plain and unshakable terms exactly how I knew the deed in my son's hand had never been signed in the presence of any notary. Because there had been no notary. Because there had been no one in that kitchen but the 3 of us. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. 31 years of authority came into that room with me and sat down in the witness chair, and everyone in it could feel it. And the woman who had lain on a floor 8 weeks earlier was nowhere to be found. I watched Douglas's lawyer realize it. I had seen that look before across many tables the moment an attorney understands that his client has handed him a bomb and called it a shield. And I watched Douglas realize it, a few seconds later watched the last of the color leave his face, as he understood that the paper he had forged to save himself had just become the thing that would sink him. Then Walter, without drama, offered the video into evidence. And the court watched in silence the 30 seconds of a woman on the floor and the sound of laughter over her, produced not by me, but by the very people who had made it. The ruling did not come with a gavel and a thunderclap the way it does in the movies. It came in careful, quiet legal language a few days later, and it was total. The court found that the purported deed was invalid and had never affected any transfer. The court quieted title in my name alone, confirming what had been true all along, that the house on Linden Street had never for one moment stopped being mine. The court ordered that Douglas and Brooke be removed as occupants, and the court's findings about the forged notarial acknowledgement were referred onward the way such things are, so that a different set of authorities could begin asking my son a different and far more dangerous set of questions about who had made that stamp and how. Brooke did not wait for any of it to finish playing out. The comfortable life she had married, the big house, and the ease and the sense of standing, all of it turned out to have been built on the same nothing Douglas had built everything on. When the nothing was exposed, she left. I heard about it from Diane, who heard it from someone in town. Brooke had packed and gone back to wherever she came from, leaving Douglas alone in the wreckage of the story he had told for years. I felt nothing about it. Not satisfaction, not pity. She had laughed while I lay on the floor. Whatever came to her after that, she had walked toward it on her own. Only after the house was legally empty after the order was final, and Douglas was gone from Linden Street, and the title stood clear and clean in my name, did the last piece move. I called the Prescotts, and I told them the way was clear, and we set a closing date. The patient couple who had agreed to wait for the court to finish clearing my path could finally have the house they had waited for. There would be no strangers arriving in a single afternoon, no crime, no shortcut. Just a proper closing, the kind I had presided over 10,000 times for other people, done at last for myself. I did not go back to the house to say goodbye to it. It had stopped being a home the moment my son put me on its floor, and no ruling could give that back. But sitting in Diane's kitchen with the final papers in front of me, I understood that I had gotten something better than the house. I had gotten the truth established and recorded and beyond argument in the one language my son had never learned to read. And I had gotten my name back. My own name alone on the only page that had ever mattered. I thought that was the end of it. I thought the worst had been the deed, the forgery, the cold theater of the courtroom. I was wrong. Because in the weeks that followed, as I began to sort through the financial records that the lawsuit had dragged into the light, I would find the thing that had been underneath all of it the whole time. The reason the question about my accounts had made Douglas stand up from that table so fast. And when I understood what they had really been doing the night on the floor, would stop looking like the end of a bad marriage between my son and his wife, and start looking like exactly what it was. The final move in a plan to take everything I had. The truth was in the numbers the way it usually is, and I found it because I was the kind of woman who reads her own statements. In the weeks after the closing, with the house behind me and Diane's spare room around me, I sat down to do the thing I had asked to do at that dinner table, the small, ordinary thing that had made my son stand up and put me on the floor. I went through my financial paperwork. All of it. Slowly, with the same patience I had once brought to other people's closings. And this time, I was not looking for a leaking faucet of a problem. I was looking for why. It took me 3 evenings to see the shape of it, because it had been done carefully in small amounts over a long time. But once I saw it, I could not unsee it, and my hands went cold the way they had on the floor. My retirement accounts, the accounts Raymond and I had spent 30 years feeding one careful deposit at a time, had been quietly bleeding. Withdrawals. Transfers. Small enough not to trigger alarms, spread out enough not to draw a single glance from anyone who was not looking. And I had not been looking because I had trusted, and trust is the exact blind spot that people like my son learn to live inside. But that was not the worst of it. Because tangled in with the financial records that the lawsuit had dragged into the light were other things. Drafts, notes, the beginnings of paperwork I recognized from a lifetime near the law, the early scaffolding of a petition to have me declared incapable of managing my own affairs. They had been building a case that I was not competent, that I could not be trusted with my own money, my own decisions, my own life. And once a court believed that a guardian would be appointed to manage everything I owned. And the person positioned to be that guardian, the devoted son who had so generously taken in his aging mother, would have been Douglas. I sat at Diane's table with those papers spread out in front of me, and I finally understood the whole design. The night on the floor had not been a marriage coming apart or a temper losing its grip. It had been a step. My question about hiring an accountant had not annoyed my son. It had terrified him because an accountant with fresh eyes would have found exactly what I had just found and found it in time to stop it. They needed me quiet. They needed me to keep believing I did not understand that stuff. They needed the house transferred and the accounts drained and my competence quietly called into question so that by the time anyone thought to check, there would be nothing left to check and no one left withstanding to check it. And the only reason the plan had failed, the single reason I was sitting at a friend's table a free woman instead of a ward stripped of her own name, was the thing they had counted on least. My mind was sharp. My records were complete. I had spent 31 years learning to keep proof of everything, and that habit, that unglamorous obsessive professional habit, had been the wall their whole scheme broke against. They had built a plan to declare me incompetent, and they had been undone by my competence. I told Walter, and he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "You didn't just save your house, Vanessa. You saved yourself. A few more months of trust, and there would have been nothing to fight for, and no one left able to fight for it. I could have chased them for all of it." Walter said the drained accounts and the incapacity scheme on top of the forgery already referred onward were more than enough to keep my son in courtrooms and worse for years. And for a night or two, I wanted that. I lay awake and I let myself want it. But when the wanting burned down, what was left was a different and quieter decision. I would recover what I could through the proper channels, and I would let the authorities pursue the forgery on their own, and then I would do the one thing that the frightened woman on the floor could never have imagined doing. I would stop. I would take what was mine, and I would walk out of the whole burning house of it, and never look back, because I finally understood that the deepest revenge available to me was not to ruin my son. It was to become happy in a life that had no room in it for him at all. So I bought a farm. It was a small place a little over an hour from Millbrook, up in the Blue Ridge near Asheville, in the green folds of Buncombe County, where the mornings come in cool, even in summer. 6 acres, a modest house with good bones, a scatter of old apple trees, and a creek that ran along the back edge of the property with a sound like something patient and unhurried. A sound like time that meant me no harm. I paid for it with the money from the sale of the house on Linden Street, the house they had tried to steal, and there was a justice in that I did not have to say out loud. The thing they had schemed to take became the thing that set me free. I gave a good portion of what remained to a shelter in Asheville, a place for women who had been battered and cornered and made small run by a steady woman named Ruth, who did not ask me a single question about why. I told her only that I knew what it was to sit at a table and be made to feel like a guest in your own life, and that I wanted other women to get out sooner than I had. Ruth took my hands and did not thank me the way you thank a stranger. She thanked me the way you thank someone who has been where you send your women every day. The first weeks on the farm were strange, the way freedom is always strange to a person who has forgotten the taste of it. I would wake before dawn out of an old habit of dread, and then remember slowly that there was no one in the house whose mood I had to measure before I got out of bed. I planted a garden because my mother had kept one, and my hands remembered how. Lettuce and tomatoes and beans herbs by the kitchen window seeds pressed into soil, that was mine. A caramel-colored dog wandered up the road one afternoon, thin and hopeful, and decided my porch was his now, and I named him Biscuit, because he turned into pure joy every time I came out with his food, and I let him stay because it turned out I had a great deal of love in me that had been going nowhere for years. I learned things that autumn that I had never had the chance to learn. I learned that a tomato you grow yourself and eat still warm from the vine tastes like a different fruit entirely than the pale ones in a store. I learned that a creek makes a different sound after rain than before it, and that if you sit still long enough on the bank in the evening, the deer stop minding you. I learned that I liked my own company, which is a thing no one had ever let me find out, because I had spent my whole life being useful to other people, and had mistaken their need for my worth. Out here there was no one to be useful to, and no one measuring me, and I discovered to my quiet astonishment that I was still here underneath all of it. Vanessa, not somebody's wife, not somebody's mother, not somebody's victim. Just a woman on a porch in the mountains, 63 years old, finding out who she had been all along. The neighbors found me the way country neighbors do without ceremony. The Caldwells farmed a larger piece a mile down the road, a retired couple who grew more than they could eat and shared the rest, and they turned up one morning with a loaf of bread still warm and a jar of blackberry preserves, and no agenda but welcome. "Out here we look after our own," Mr. Caldwell said, and I found to my surprise that I believed him. His wife folded me into a Sunday dinner where I met a dozen more of them plain and genuine people who knew me only as Vanessa from the old Harlow place, not as somebody's mother or somebody's victim, or the woman from the news about the forged deed. Just Vanessa. It was the first name I had answered to in years that came with nothing attached to it. And slowly, the thing I had not expected began to happen. Women started to find me. It began when Ruth asked gently whether I would come and talk to some of the women at the shelter, not as a counselor, I had no training for that, but simply as someone who had gotten out. So I went. And I told the truth plainly the way I had learned to tell it. And something in the room shifted when the women realized I was not there to fix them or pity them, but only to say in a voice that meant it I understand, because it happened to me too, and I am standing here anyway. One of them was a woman named Dorothy, 72 years old, a retired school teacher with careful white hair and hands that shook a little when she held her coffee. She had come to the shelter after running from a son who had taken control of her pension and cut her off from every friend she had one by one until there was no one left to notice she was disappearing. She had heard my story secondhand, and she had held on to it, she told me, the way you hold on to a light you can see across a dark field. If she could do it at 63, Dorothy had told herself then, maybe I can do it at 72. She reached out and took my hand, and her grip was stronger than her shaking suggested, and she said, "You gave me a door I didn't know was there. Every one of us finds our own way through it," I told her. "The only thing that matters is taking the first step. It is always the hardest one, and it is never the last." That is how the group began the thing that would give the rest of my life its shape. Every couple of weeks at Ruth's shelter, a circle of women of every age would gather and share the small, brave, ordinary business of starting over. I did not lead it so much as hold the door for it. And in that circle I understood finally what my son had never been able to take from me, because it turned out I had not lost it on that floor. I had only misplaced it. My worth. It had never depended on being useful to him. It had never depended on being loved by him. It had been mine the whole time. It was late autumn, the apple trees bare, and the creek running high with cold when Douglas came to the farm. I heard the car before I saw it, and Biscuit lifted his head from the porch boards, and my heart did the old frightened thing for one beat before it settled. I had known this day would come. A man does not lose everything he built on a lie without one day needing to stand in front of the person who took the lie away. I stood up as the car stopped under the bare apple trees, and my son got out, and I almost did not know him. He was thin and gray and diminished older than his years, all the arrogance gone out of him, and nothing left in its place but a man who had finally seen the bottom of what he was. He did not come up the steps. He stood at the foot of them in the cold, and he looked at me for a long moment, and I saw him take in the porch and the garden and the dog and the mountains behind it all, and I saw him understand that I was not surviving out here. I was living. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. His voice was rough. "I know I don't have the right. I just needed to give you this." He held out his hand, and in it was a small worn box, and I came down one step and took it and opened it. And my breath went out of me. Inside was Raymond's wedding ring. His ring, the plain gold band he had worn for 34 years, the ring I had thought was lost forever, thrown out or sold in the chaos of everything Brooke had swept away. I had grieved it as one more thing they had taken. And here it was, warm from my son's pocket, cradled in a box. "I found it," Douglas said, and his voice broke on the words in a drawer in a box of things that got left behind. "I know it was Dad's. I know what it meant to you. I couldn't keep it. I couldn't have it in the same house as everything I did." I closed my hand around the ring, and I felt 34 years of a good marriage in that small, cold weight, and I looked at my son and I waited to feel the thing I had once been sure I would feel in this moment. Forgiveness. It did not come. Some breaks do not heal, and this was one of them, and I had made my peace with that a long time ago on the floor of a house that was no longer his. But I felt something else, something quieter and stranger. I looked at Douglas, and I did not see the boy I had raised, and I did not see the man who had put me down, and I did not see an enemy. I saw a stranger who had done a terrible thing and was trying too late to carry a small piece of it back. "Thank you for bringing this," I said. I meant it. It was the truest thing I could offer him, and it was not a door back in. He nodded, and he understood, I think, that this was all there would be. No embrace, no forgiveness spoken. No promise of a next time, just a mother taking back her husband's ring from a son she would not be seeing again. He said he was moving away to another city to try to build something out of what was left of himself. I told him I hoped he found it. I did hope that. You can hope a person finds their way and still know your own way runs somewhere they can never follow. "Goodbye, Vanessa," he said. He used my name, not the other word, and I understood that he had finally learned the boundary that had cost me so much to draw. "Goodbye, Douglas," I said. He got back in his car and drove down the dirt road, and I stood on the porch and watched the dust settle behind him until the road was empty again, and the only sound was the creek. Then I went inside and I took Raymond's ring, and I put it on a chain around my neck where I could feel it close to me where it belonged. And Biscuit followed me in, and the light came slanting gold through the kitchen window across the herbs on the sill, and I stood there in the quiet of a house that was mine entirely and beyond argument. Mine, and I felt the thing settle over me that I had chased my whole life without knowing its name. Peace. I am 63 years old. My son put me on the floor of a house he thought he had stolen, and his wife laughed while she filmed it, and they had a plan to take the rest of me too, my money and my name and my standing as a person, allowed to run her own life. And they failed. Not because I was lucky, because I was awake and I kept my records and I knew exactly what I was worth in dollars and in every other way, and I refused finally and completely to be made small. If you are listening to this, whatever your age, whether you are trapped in something you cannot yet see your way out of, or just beginning to notice the shape of the walls around you, I want you to hear the one thing I know for certain now. It is never too late. It is never too late to say no. It is never too late to keep the proof, to draw the line, to walk out of the story someone else has written for you and start writing your own. I did it at 63 on the floor of a house with a bruise on my arm and nothing but a folder full of paper and the stubborn refusal to disappear. And I am telling you from a porch in the mountains with a good dog at my feet and my husband's ring against my heart that a life can bloom more beautifully after the storm than it ever did before it. The strongest roots grow in the ground that got turned all the way over. And it is never ever too late to look at what is left and say out loud, "This life is mine."